Let's jump right in. I'm stalling a little bit as I see people joining. Appreciate everybody coming. Wow, great turnout as always. Well, tonight's webinar is Individualizing Your Training with WKO5. My name is Tim Cusick, and I am the WKO product leader. Actually, I have a little picture here of myself. I'm supposed to do a better job at introducing. And yes, I am the TrainingPeaks WKO product leader, but I know we have a lot of new names here, and I see a fair amount, and I see some that I know. I'm also a master coach with Velocious Endurance Coaching, so I do have a background in both the data analytics software side, and I do coach. I do work with professional athletes, and have had some pretty high-level experience. So it gives me an excellent blend to kind of talk about this stuff, as I do understand the coaching side, and I do understand the software side and the data analytics side. So hopefully I can pass on some of that knowledge to the team. As with all webinars, this one's pretty much about the facts, but when we're talking about opinions or answering questions, I'm a firm believer that each coach should kind of formalize their own opinion, their own answers. I'll give you my thinking and thoughts, but I encourage you to vet them and find out and formulate your own answers. As we go through tonight's webinar, I really encourage you to ask questions as we go. I'll track your questions on a second screen, and I can usually do a pretty good job of blending them right in. I haven't been doing as many webinars as I used to do, so I'm going to have to get my practice back in a little bit here, but I should be ready to keep up. It usually doesn't put me off too much. The thing is, I hate answering all the questions at the end, because sometimes the question is really pertinent to something on the screen, and letting time go by doesn't help. Okay, that's my couple of minutes stall as I see more and more people joining. Here we go. So let's start this talking about this idea of individualizing your training, and it goes back to kind of a simple background. I'm going to take you through a couple slides of background, and that starts with no two athletes are alike. The reality is, when we look at training, you know, the human being is a very complex system, right? And the reality is, what has happened, particularly over maybe the last 20 to 25 years, which has been changing over the last 20, we've developed a very systematized way of training endurance athletes. And we've actually trained them more alike than we probably should. Why? Well, in the absence of the ability to understand the performing athlete's unique physiology, we actually lack the ability, or lacked, I guess I should use past tense in that, but we lack the ability to fully individualize training systems. And don't get me wrong, maybe if you were a professional athlete with access to labs and stuff like that, you tended to be able to utilize very individualized systems, but it hasn't been something easily accessible to the masses. The background of training, we've been relying on generalized rules, which I'm going to kind of go over here as we go through the presentation. Our training targets are based on a bell curve of population. I'm going to bust some myths for people here also. And the reality, the tracking the response from training has been through a limited lens. And here's what I mean by a limited lens, right? And this is kind of, it's something I point out about individualized training, and it's a little bit cryptic, right? But if you think about it, it will make sense. When we don't have the ability to individualize, when we don't have the ability to look at the performing athlete's physiology, we don't know what we don't know. And it's like, that really is powerful if you start thinking about when we're training an athlete, we're looking for peak performance, we're trying to achieve something special. So a little bit more background, right? The reality is, there are a bunch of well-known training systems out there. And when I say a training system, let's talk about intensity targeting at the core. And it's usually time and intensity, right? Time and intensity. And the reality is, those systems were designed in a surprisingly simple process. Some pretty smart people, scientists, exercise physiologists, well-known coaches, who each developed these systems, basically looked down and took one point. So let's use the WKO classic zones. The people behind that took one point, and which we know as functional threshold power, or threshold, or functioning, or threshold, and there's a whole discussion of that coming up. And then they basically looked at a lot of data, and they said, when you are going 110%, you're actually taxing your VO2 max, your max aerobic kind of system. But if you go 135%, I think it looks like you're taxing your anaerobic capacity system. We tend to believe that there was something more mystic behind those systems, whether it was, the Coggan Classic zones, whether it was Joe Friel zones and stuff like that. There really wasn't. It was observational data with good data behind it and smart science and really smart people creating it. But the reality was it's not quite as scientific as you would think. And it was based off a bell curve of data. Well, the challenge of the bell curve of data, as we really look at it, is that just gives us some general functional rules. Only about, and I can tell you in observing now that we've gone to the more individualized approach over the last 4 or 5 years, probably about half the population fit in the bell curve, right on the math, right? Hence the term bell curve. But the reality is that means that half the population are one extreme over here and the other half the population is the other extreme over there. And following a set of general functional rules or general principles to training means they're not maximizing their training results. And we needed to create a system of more individualized training. When we sat down and we developed WKO4, that was our core goal. We wanted to look at the athlete themselves and give coaches and self-coach athletes the ability to really understand who they were, not, in the sense of physiology and how they make energy and stuff, and then how to train themselves or train their athlete. And that led us to this theory, this terminology of individualized training. We're really not great at naming stuff. If you ever noticed, it's pretty plain, but it works pretty well. Individualized training is training that recognizes the unique physiology of the individual athlete, allowing for specific, highly focused diagnostic analysis, training prescription, and individualized performance analytics to improve training efficiency and effectiveness. So the whole goal is if we better understand your physiology, we can create more effective training programs. It really was our simple system. As we set out to do it, we saw it as an evolution from random training, back with a stopwatch and back in the day. And that's not quite random, as you know, but generally it's pretty broad. It's pretty perceived exertion style training, into the generalized training rules. As we saw heart rate monitors and then power meters follow, we saw a series of generalized rules take place. Heart rate zones, a lot of power zones, whether you're running or cycling, are all kind of generalized training rules. And now in the last 5 years, and it's not just us, I'd like to believe we've kind of led the thrust to some degree, but the reality, you see more and more training becoming individualized and ways to individualize it. We basically look at this idea of developing an individual training and response footprint, and it really is individual. But to do that, we needed to start with a highly accurate human performance model that understands you and the elements that make you perform in endurance sports. We broke those endurance sports into 3 areas of strength: metabolic, you could call that muscular metabolic, and fatigue. And in strength, we're talking about things like, but not limited to, neuromuscular power, force strength. At metabolic, we're talking about anaerobic and aerobic capacity. There's more to it than that, but just in its general field, that's a pretty good start. And in fatigue, we're talking about endurance, stamina, and resistance. We wanted to be able to better understand the individual athlete and then use that understanding to better train them. That led to the development of our human performance model, which I'm going to get into in a moment. And it basically, what is a human performance model though? It really is a data-driven development and application of a predictive, reliable, executable, and quantitative model of human performance. The part in red here is pretty important, and when I explain the power duration curve a little bit, you're going to see why. But what we really wanted to bring to the everyday athlete is we wanted to evolve training, and we wanted to evolve it from data you could only get in the lab into modeled data. And that's what we think we've done a pretty good job of, and we're about to go through slides on and explain this a little bit. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. Sorry about that. Okay, so the lab, you can go in and get hooked up to all, a bunch of apparatus and go in to do testing, and lab testing gives us deeper insight into the physiology of the athlete. That physiology can be used for training. Well, I believe the human performance model and the math, right, the analytics, can basically do the same. I would put out the argument, which would be contested. Again, remember, this is what I'm about to say is my opinion. The lab and the model can be generally as accurate. I'll give you an example. The average VO2 max test completed in the lab has a plus minus of accuracy of 5 to 8%. We've measured our VO2 max in the model to a plus minus accuracy of 4 to 6%. So neither are perfect, but the reality is we tend to think some things are better than the others, and they're not. So unfortunately, the reality, we can break most of us down to the math, right? It's kind of scary, but the reality is we can do it. So to do and accomplish that, we developed the power duration model. The power duration model was developed by the WKO team, and the physiologist behind it was Dr. Andy Coggin. Andy came up with this idea of developing a model, and remember, it needs to be a predictive, reliable, quantitative construct. Now, with a lot of new users on here, and I see a fair amount of new names, I want to just take a simple look at things. When I see it on Facebook and I see it on forums and I watch people overthink these things sometimes, we just don't look at the obvious, right? This is Joe Ryder. Some of this is my data. Some of this is some people that I ride with. It's kind of a weird conglomerate. The yellow line you're seeing here, right, the yellow line, that's this athlete's, this is Joe Ryder's mean maximal power. And in simple terms, this is their actual power over time. 1 second, 2 seconds, 2 minutes, 40 minutes, 5 hours, right? The red line is the power duration curve, the model. And you can visually look at this pretty quick and say, you know what? That fits pretty well. It's pretty darn close. Yeah, there's some odd data here and some odd data here, and in other webinars and some of the training and education information on the Quick Start Guide, I show you how to deal with that. But it really isn't far off, right? The idea of it being predictable and reliable, the yellow data, my actual data, is a little too noisy to use in good analytics, right? I got a little too high here, a little there. It's not predictable. It's not reliable. The power duration curve is making it that. But visually, when people have get into all these discussions about is it me, is it not, if you're, think about this every time, if your red line fits nice and close to your yellow line, it's pretty close. It's pretty close, as you can see. Now, the power duration curve model, we weren't the first people to think of modeling endurance performance or human performance models. Bannister wrote the initial model. It was one of the better ones out there, but it was overly simple and had some flaws. Busso really did the best job of revising the Bannister model, and the power duration Coggin model sort of re-simplified it, but also made it more accurate. That's an understatement of what Andy created, but the reality is it is a simple way of looking at the model. The other model that most of us are familiar with is the critical power model. The critical power model's been in play for a while, so there's more than one model. There's other models out there that are not ours. We've tested our model time and time again, and we use a couple of mathematical systems for testing. This is just root mean of square errors. And when we look at the same data sets against the critical power models, against the AIS model, against different models, the WKO4 model really fits in very accurately and is probably the most accurate one. Not probably, I mean mathematically, the facts, it's the most accurate one on the list. So basically, we did create a human performance model. We call it the power duration curve, and we believe it's a highly accurate model. Once we have that, we can begin the journey of individualizing because we have a better system of modeling. Now, I show this slide a fair amount, and if you're new, understanding this slide is the secret to improving your training with all of this data, right? Basically, what we're doing by using a human performance model is we're using this specific exercising athlete to better understand their physiology, and then using their specific physiology to better understand how to specifically train them. Just to go a tad deeper in what that means, understand that the model is driven off Joe Ryder, what we were just looking at. So we're using Joe Ryder's specific data. We're not using generalized data. We're not using estimated curves. We're not using other factors. We're simply using that athlete's performing data, Joe Ryder's data, to better understand their physiology. And once we understand that physiology, we'll better understand how to train them. And all of that really is the key to individualization. So when we begin to talk about this individualization, let's take a look at 4 key areas. The power duration model allows us to utilize new physiological metrics, model-derived physiological scoring of those, which I'm going to get into them all now. It gives us iLevels, a new, more individualized way of targeting training intensities. It gives us optimized intervals, a more specific way of prescribing work and training loads, or I should say training prescription. And then finally, it gives us a wealth of advanced analytics. So let's dig in by simply starting with the new physiological metrics. Here's a quick overview of the key things, the key outputs of the power duration model. At the core, we have the phenotype, and I'm going to go through each one of these quickly. The model parameters derived metrics are Pmax, functional reserve capacity, or FRC, your modeled VO2 max, your modeled functional threshold power, or MFTP, and we also have model driven. They're just created slightly different. These are parameters of the model, these are outputs of stamina, TTE, or time to exhaustion, and we actually have muscle fiber type, which is kind of the slightly ignored child of the model. We don't look at this enough. So let's dig into what each one of these are. I'm going to try to do this reasonably quickly because there's other resources, but understanding it is important. And please, again, feel free to ask questions as I go. At the core of all the model is phenotype. And phenotyping really is the objective classification of an athlete into one of 4. For now, we're still looking at more phenotypes, into one of 4 phenotypes. And it really is based on the overall shape of the athlete's power duration relationship. And we have pursuiter, TT, all-arounder, and sprinter. So pursuit, time trial, all-around, sprint. And the phenotype simply is a set of observable characteristics of an individual resulting from the interaction of its genotype with the environment, which is a fancy way of saying it's just grouping people that make power the same way together. A simpler way to look at it is, and for everybody to understand, because this can lead to some confusion, is this. It's the shape of the curve. So what this chart is showing you is power as a percentage of FTP over time, as a percentage of FTP. So a sprinter, right, might have their power might be more than 400% of their threshold, and they tend to have a very steep curve like this. Now, it's the shape of the curve that matters, not the height. Meaning, if you had a 200-watt threshold and an 850-watt sprint, you'd probably still be a sprinter. That's the shape. You have a high relationship of sprint to threshold. It doesn't mean you're the greatest sprinter in the world. It just gives you insight into how you make power, how you create velocity in running or cycling. All-arounders have a little better sprint, but tend to flatten out through the others. Pursuiters have a higher anaerobic capacity. You notice they're way flatter up here and then tend to drop off. And the classic TT, they have the flattest curve. So remember, it's not the height of your curve. I see sprinters all the time say, but I really don't have a great sprint. It's 1,000 watts. Yes, but it's the relationship of how you make power of your Pmax to your FTP. Let's get into the definition of the power duration metrics. Let's talk Pmax. Pmax is the maximal power that can be generated for a very short period of time. Units are in watts or watts per kilogram. It is the maximum power over at least a full pedal revolution with both legs. That's really important because when we start talking about power meters, right, the reason we don't like using just a max 1 second, we want the power derived or the power duration modeled metric of Pmax, is you pick up a lot of noise in a max 1 second. And you have a data spike, right? Like I went out last week and I was just riding up some hill and I did 1,800 watts for 1 second. Now, whereas, and I'd like to believe that is my max power, the reality of it, since I probably couldn't break 1100 watts, repeatably, chances of that 1800 watt being just a spike are pretty high. By utilizing a full revolution, a modeled full revolution, each leg going around one full revolution, I make sure I'm getting an accurate modeled number. And I can actually identify power spikes by using that Pmax number. Also, when you sprint, right, let's say you're sprinting at 120 RPM, which is not that much, is not that fast of a cadence for a very good sprinter. That means your data is being, all data is typically recorded once a second. But if you're spinning at 120 RPM, you're actually producing a lot more data than is being recorded. Where does that extra data go? When do they record that data? It tends to be at the end of a revolution, but the reality is you don't know. So it could be higher or lower. It's just, not the most accurate way to grab the data. So the Pmax model gives you a better set. And finally, better than max 5 seconds. It is better than max 5 seconds because you tend to fatigue and begin to show signs of fatigue in a 5-second sprint. These are the Pmax standards. You can download this presentation. If you look at your little gray bar, the same question area, look underneath, there is a handout. This presentation's in there. I'm not going to read all of the standards because you guys can look at them post, or they're actually in WKO5 in the insights and the profile sections. You can just utilize the charts themselves. The Pmax standards are based off our WKO database of users. And it just gives you some insight into generally where you stand. And it is broken down by sex, but not age. It is also not weight graded, meaning we don't know the athlete's weights. These are just some general numbers that we see. Not general numbers, but this is the pattern of the numbers we have in the database. Okay, that's Pmax. Let's talk about functional reserve capacity, or FRC. Functional reserve capacity is the total amount of work that can be done during continuous exercise above FTP before fatigue occurs. Units are in kilojoules or joules per kilogram. So the reality is, basically, this is the work you can do over threshold. The place where a lot of people get confused, it's continuous. It's a measurement of continuous exercise. To look to simplify the definition, think about it as your anaerobic battery. So if you're riding along, you're warming up for your 15 minutes, you're not going that hard, your anaerobic battery is totally full. Show up at the local group ride, you chat in the parking lot for 5 minutes, somebody says go, you're out of the parking lot, and it's full bore, right? And you're over threshold. As soon as you start going over threshold, you're burning down this battery. How much you go over threshold dictates how fast, how quickly you go through that battery. Your Pmax, well, that's the maximal use. So if you sprint as hard as you can at Pmax, you're basically draining down the battery as quickly as you can. And the reality is, the harder you go, the faster that battery drains. The reality is, once it's drained, rest must occur. And we've felt this before. If you've been on that fast group ride or in a race and you're trying to bridge over, it's like, you're dig, and you're maybe 20 yards or meters away, and you just run out of gas. You just can't chase anymore. That's because your FRC has been depleted, and you have to rest. And the reality is that rest must occur under FTP. That rest must occur under FTP. The further under FTP, the faster you will recharge your battery, even though you generally don't tend to recharge it totally. I mean, you will maybe once or twice, but then it starts to not fill back up. Now, classically, we would refer to work over threshold as anaerobic work capacity. That's the critical power model basis. And really, besides the fancy science of it, anaerobic work capacity is a measurement of the energy you make purely anaerobically above threshold. Functional reserve capacity is the same thing, except it takes in the small amount of aerobic energy that you are contributing. You are still breathing, right? If you go 40 seconds as hard as you can, it's not like you're not breathing. As a matter of fact, you're probably breathing pretty freaking hard, right? So you are getting you are bringing in enough oxygen to make some aerobic energy. So the only really difference here is anaerobic work capacity is a measurement of the true anaerobic or just the anaerobic. Functional, that's why we call it functional, is basically all the power you make over threshold. A little bit aerobic, a whole lot of it anaerobic, but it just measures the whole battery. Here are FRC standards for men and women based in kilojoules. Again, I'm not going to review these. You can download the presentation or just use WKO5 and look at the standards. Next, we have modeled VO2 max, or just VO2 max, and in its simplest term, the maximum amount of oxygen the body can use during a specified period of usually intense exercise. And if we start talking about VO2 max and its role and importance, and I stole this from one of Andy Coggin's presentations, why is VO2 max so important? I think this breaks it down into the 3 key areas. Most people start with this last key area. As such, having an adequately high VO2 max is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to be an elite endurance athlete, right? We just look at it, if it's high, I could go pro. But the reality is the more important measurements and how it should affect your training is VO2 max is the best overall measure of cardiovascular fitness and sets the upper limit to the production of energy, ATP, via aerobic metabolism. So the reality is understand, and it's funny, I was looking on the Facebook group the last couple of days, 2 or 3 people have posted me about looking for unique tracking formats for their aerobic condition. Here's a unique tracking format. Use your VO2 max. Don't overcomplicate things, right? It really gives you excellent insight into the cardiovascular fitness and your aerobic energy capability, and allows you to track changes over time in that fitness. Now, there are some other metrics underneath that you want to look at. Efficiency is not, aerobic efficiency really is not a bad one if you look at it over time and you're not overly specific. And there are some heart rate metrics and data that might help you, but VO2 max really is one of the ones that you should be tracking over time and really telling it, because 1, it is a measure of cardiovascular system, and 2, it is the upper limit of the aerobic energy you're going to set. So those are 2 things. If you're developing your aerobic engine, those are 2, the same thing, but 2 kind of aspects that you really want to focus on. Next, we have modeled functional threshold power, and that simply is the model-derived highest power a rider can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. I know a lot of people, and I still see it getting hammered on forums, and poor Andy always has to defend it, says, well, you know, it's the power you can make for an hour. Andy never said that. I've been working with him from the beginning. It's an unfair to pin him. I've learned over time, as you write articles and have to put out information, when you oversimplify things, even if you say this is oversimplified or approximately, people just pin it to you. Andy's always said approximately. He said 40K if you actually read so much of his original stuff, because it tends to be around an hour. Standards of FTP are here, again, not weighted, meaning they don't take weight into account. This is just a raw power output. We're not really looking at weight. Finally, one of the key points of functional threshold power, it is the greatest, but not the only, indicator of performance success. If somebody was going to say of all these metrics and physiology and what should I focus, if I had just time to focus on one, what should I focus on? Focused on threshold. It will give you the highest propensity, the highest chances of success in the greatest number of sports. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're a track sprinter and that's the only thing you're doing, FTP might not be that relevant to you. But for most of the sports, whether it's cycling or running, the reality is it's an aerobic sport, and building the aerobic engine will give you the highest return, the biggest bang for your buck. All right, let's take a quick look at some model-derived metrics. First, we have time to exhaustion. Pretty simple here. The maximum duration for which a power equal to FTP can be maintained. So basically, when do you start dropping off your threshold power? in a way that the model knows, or you won't come back to it. It's not like I'm going to resurge, you've literally exhausted, you're exhausted, and now you're dropping off power at threshold. Now, time to exhaustion, you should look at it when you look at MFTP, MFTP is just, a good hard metric. Time to exhaustion, if you have a very flat model, can be a little tricky. But it gives you excellent insight into at what point you begin to fall off that FTP. If you're looking at raising your TTE, and I'll be doing some webinars on this, if you want to increase your FTP, that also typically tends to increase your TTE. Think about that power duration curve I showed you. If you lift it up, right, the exhaustion, the time you start dropping off moves further to the right. The other way you can do is to extend the TTE. And that's pushing that curve to the right. And I've preached this a lot, but I see a lot of new faces and names on here. The reason when you load and you see your TTEs being 30 minutes and 35 minutes, the world has gone to doing, or a lot of our training in the 2x20. We don't ride many intervals anymore hard over 20 minutes. And then when you see a TTE, a time to exhaustion of 35 minutes, you're like, man, why am I dropping off so quick? Well, because you're not pushing everything to the right. What if instead of doing 2x20 minute at SST, start going out and doing 1x40 or 1x60 or 2x40 even if you could do it. Start doing, if you want to move TTE to the right, you got to put the specific demand. The specificity principle said, you got to push what you want. You have to introduce that overload. Finally, we have stamina. Stamina is a measure of resistance to fatigue during prolonged duration, moderate intensity exercise, at least over an hour. One of the problems is sometimes people will see their stamina be blank up in their top right-hand corner, where it won't calculate in their reports. And then if you don't ride more than at least an hour, and probably more like an hour and a half, there's no data to produce stamina, so you're going to get a dash. Right? So stamina is the resistance to fatigue during prolonged duration, moderate steady state efforts. Units are % of maximum from 0 to 100. Most individuals fall between 70 and 90. The simplest way to explain it is this image. Your stamina and all your metrics are up here. Look at the power duration curve. This line is threshold. This line is how you're declining off threshold. Stamina is a measurement of that decline rate. Now, even though I put a little blue arrow here, it's not at a specific time. You might only have, ridden 2 hours, and another athlete might have 24 hours, right? It's the rate of drop-off. So if you were a crit racer, it's probably not all that important metric to you. If you're an Ironman, if you are a ultra runner, it's probably a highly important one to you. So that's basically what stamina is. And finally, we have muscle fiber type. There are different fiber types. There's fast twitch, slow twitch, A, B, 1, 2, all of that science. But the reality is these muscle fiber types in your body, which are classified based on how they produce energy. And that's an odd way of saying it. You could look at their force strength, how they contract, speed. There's a bunch of ways to do it. But when you're talking about fast twitch, slow twitch, and you're training in a muscular metabolic way, that's the simplest way to look at it. And yes, these different fibers can be trained using specific exercises designed to focus on how they create energy and generate force. And this goes into when you're talking about specificity, the idea of you have fast twitch A and B, and you can teach fast twitch B fibers to act like slow twitch, and there's a lot of reason to do that because slow twitch is more efficient, blah, blah, blah. You can train those fiber types. The muscle fiber type model, if you're not really maximizing, if you don't have a good range of data like a track sprinter and some things like that, I would say the error rate could be as high as 5 to 10%. But I do believe that change will be precise, meaning if it's X% now, it will generally track with the same off as your model. So it's not a perfect science when we're doing muscle fiber type, but it is reasonably predictable. Again, we want predictable, reliable, and quantitative. So if you went and had a biopsy done, somebody drew a big hole in your legs and started figuring out your fiber, you might find that it's 5% different than what the model says, but it's a whole lot easier to get it from the model, and the changes over time should be reasonably predictive. These collection of information gives you what we call our information physiological metrics, right? You have the 360-degree athlete view simply by using the model. And the reality in utilizing the model is you start with this, you can diagnose this, and you can diagnose the athlete using this, and then you can track training in very quick examples. And I want to give you an example, and I'm going to use the same image. What I will often talk about in my coaching education is the cost benefit of training. When you introduce specific training or training specificity, you're going to gain somewhere, but you're going to lose somewhere else. And that's what I mean by cost benefit. So I'm going to use this little diagram, right, to give you a visual example of tracking that can be done in different scenarios, different case studies here real quick. That'll give you some insight of why or how this physiological data could be utilized. So let's take an example of a trainer doing some sprint, an athlete doing some sprint training, run or on the track cycling, doesn't matter, you can pick what suits you. They start, let's just say everything starts here in kind of the equal relationship, because I'm just giving a visual relationship. So the before Pmax was 1300 and some change, their FRC was 15.5, and I made these numbers up, so they're sort of nonsensical. Not too bad, but there's no true athlete here. So their VO2 max is 65.1, their MFTP is 255. Probably if they had that, this would be higher, unless they're about 40 kilos, and a TTE of 50 minutes. So let's say they do a cycle or two of training focusing on sprint. You look at what's after, right? Well, now their Pmax is 15.15. Their FRC has gone up some, not huge, but some. VO2 max, no real change. But man, look, the threshold has significantly dropped. The model threshold has shown a pretty big drop. And so is TTE. Now, if this is a track sprinter or maybe even a pursuit type of rider, that's not too bad. That's pretty good, right? You had a pretty good gain, maybe in a cycle or two. But if you're a road racer who's already dangling at the back of the brake every race, the cost of gaining that sprint might keep you from making the breaks or making the lead group. That's the cost benefit. You as the coach or the self-coached athlete has to determine, was that cost worth it? But you can track these metrics. Remember, the power duration model is live. And every time you add new data to it, today's workout, tomorrow's workout, it evolves with the athlete fitness. And as long as you're following a basic unstructured testing, literally, you don't need to test in a formal way. And I teach unstructured testing in the Quick Start education. You simply can know in a 4-week cycle. So I don't have to wait to the end of the season to be like, man, I did sprint better, but I just couldn't keep up with the break. 4, 6, 8 weeks in, I can start to see these pattern, right? This is where I started. Suddenly, oh man, I'm losing a lot. Pmax is getting stronger, but I'm losing some of these. That's how you can use individual physiological metrics to track. And I would have done my initial diagnostics off this too. Let's do an example of a crit or a one-day racer. I don't want to get too deep into this. I think you guys will get it. Pmax basically after 4 to 6, 8 weeks is flat. Nice increase in FRC, looks pretty good. VO2 max moved also in this, and they really didn't give up much threshold. And for a crit racer, and one-day racer, a little change in TTE, but not that big of a deal. So they start with this nice clean. All right, we give up a little TTE, FRC, VO2 max went up. You might consider that success, or maybe not. Mountain bike training, you're looking for that higher VO2 max and FRC, so okay. Sprint stays the same, nice increase in FRC, nice increase in VO2 max, actually ended up going up in MFTP, so everything went up except the TTE, probably a success in what you're training to do, great. And you can't forget the time trialists, same kind of equation, so Pmax ends up going down, FRC goes up a little, for this case VO2 max goes up a little, but threshold really goes up. Those two will tend to move somewhat together. Wow, another big success. But the point I'm making here, right, you could measure this every 4-week cycle, every training cycle, and measure and measure. You don't need this much of a change. The question you want to ask, and if you watch the training and coaching with WKO I just did about, creating your training strategy and having milestones and putting together your rubric and knowing what you're targeting. The reality is you could track this each month and saying, man, right out of the gate, we look good. This is going right. I'm going to stay on this strategy. Or right out of the gate, man, this looks wrong. I need to tweak that strategy. So the physiological metrics give you excellent diagnostic, an excellent 360 look at the athlete, and an excellent ability to track their actual physiological changes. All right, let's press on and talk about iLevels. So the reality is, when we looked at the kind of classic training levels or zones, they were percentage based. We measured threshold, the FTP, functional threshold power, and then basically gave the percentage number of change. Anaerobic capacity starts at 135, VO2 max starts at 105 or 106, depending on how you're looking at it, right? That was just done by looking at a bunch of data, and people like Andy or Joe Friel and they just basically picked that line. There wasn't as much science. There was excellent scientists behind it, but it wasn't driven by a mathematical construct. Well, iLevels are. And here's what it wanted to solve, right? The problem of classic training, the problem of the classic iLevels, or the classic training levels or zones. So this is all the athletes in the database. Again, we're using power as a percentage of FTP. And each line is an athlete, right? And if you notice here out in the longer durations, there really isn't much variation until you start getting into that threshold area. And by the time you go above threshold, you're like, wow, there really is a lot of variation. And it's really important you understand the next animation if you want to get and understand the key to what's happening here is, but yet a percentage-based training system based off, off of threshold makes all of these athletes train like that. And that's not too bad when we weren't smarter about it. We didn't have the data we have now. That was a pretty good starting point, and people figured out better answers. But the reality is there's no better guidance in using classic training zones than just the bell curve average. Somewhere down the middle of all those squiggly lines, that's pretty much what it is. So if you're one of these, it's probably not right for you. If you're one of these, it's probably not right for you. So let me show you an actual demo of this. I'm going to take two athletes and run through a couple of slides of demo, because I think for new users of WKO who haven't kind of had this epiphany, it's so important that you understand it. So this is the classic training zones or Coggin classic zones in WKO. And let's take Jane Ryder, who has a threshold of 275 watts, and Joe Ryder, who has a threshold of 270. These are slightly rounded, as I'll show you in a moment. And the reality is they each have their training zones. And if you pick one, let's pick VO2 max as a training zone. Jane is 292 to 333 watts. And if you remember, the classic zones tell you should do work in 3 to 8 minutes for VO2 max. So a general assumption of time. And if you look at the same for Joe, he's 286 to 327, so within 4 watts of Jane. So Jane and Joe at VO2 max intervals are 4 watts apart. Okay, pretty simple, easy to execute. Let's take a look at Jane and Joe Ryder, though. Let's look at their power duration curves. Well, if you look at them, and there's a little bit of different scaling going on here, right? But they kind of look like the same shape. But yet if you actually look at Joe, Joe doesn't have the short power that Jane has here. As a matter of fact, Joe, if I use his 650 kind of number, I'm just estimating, and my arrow's not that great, but it would be way down here in this scale. So what would happen if I put them on the same scale? Meaning, this is the watt scale, right? If I scaled the axis the same. Well, Jane and Joe would look like this. Jane actually goes off the charts. So suddenly, when you look at them like this, they look similar. Even when you look at them like this, they look similar, right? But when you start to understand that they're on different scales, you're like, wow, that looks different. Jane can't even chart when I lock down the scale. So the reality is that this classic system treats them like this, not like this. So the classic system results in them doing the same thing. So now the idea of iLevels, and it took Andy and I worked on iLevels for a year to create them. And basically I kept bugging him that we needed them, and he kept saying, no, people will find a way. We'll start with classic. And then I kept proving him how many times I could break the classic zones, because I am a normalized power buster. I am one of those people who have low threshold and higher anaerobic capability. And eventually, we worked it through. I did a lot of testing, a lot of laying on the side of the road, breathing heavily, throwing up, whatever it takes. Just so you guys know, I took one for the team. And eventually we developed iLevels out of all that testing. And it really is the matter. What we were testing was the power duration curve and its accuracy. So the iLevels utilize the whole curve. It's a combination of threshold and the curve, which I'll get into. But the reality is it uses all of your data to set, not just this line, not just threshold. It uses your entire power duration curve to set your training targets. So now if we look at Jane and Joe Ryder, right, we have a different view. And these are iLevels. There's more levels in iLevels, and there are other webinars and things where I'll teach this deeper. Right now I'm trying to tell you the importance of individualizing your training. Let's take something like FRC workouts here, right? So for Jane, who had the little better engine, her FRC work is 419 to 574. And now, because we have the power duration curve, we can also be better predictive of the time. They should do work between 39 seconds and 1:43. Now this would relate 419 watts at 1:43 up to 574 watts at 39 seconds. So in that range on the curve, right, that's where Jane wants to be developing her functional reserve capacity, her anaerobic work capacity. But now Joe, who didn't come as high on the scale when we even things up, his FRC work is 390 to 465, and he's only 26 seconds to 101. In that sense, they've both been individualized. Remember, in classic zones in that range, they would have basically been doing the same workload, the same target effort, the same target time. And suddenly iLevels gives you the ability to totally understand. Now, what are the benefits of the power duration iLevels? I'm just going to kind of speed through this. It gives us better diagnostic. The power duration gives us better diagnostic. Understanding the power duration curve gives us phenotype, strength, all the things that we just went, and allows us to utilize iLevels for planning, individuality, specificity, and diagnostic targeting. It also gives us a new language, a more clear, more precise language to talk with our athletes. And most importantly, it gives us tracking. It gives us micro changes in fitness. So when you look at iLevels, when you get the classic levels, they only change when you choose to change threshold. iLevels are based on your power duration curve. So as the athlete has new bests or old bests or their fitness changes, so do the iLevels. It happens as part of the model. You as the coach just have to make sure the athlete is maintaining their model, and everything will fall into place. So as they have micro changes in fitness, so are their iLevel targets. Therefore, you know you're always targeting the most precise target. That's the background of iLevels and Individualized. Now let's talk about optimized intervals, and I'm close to getting this wrapped up, I promise. So iLevels work great as a description, but we wanted, meaning it was great to go out and do the work and then come back and say, wow, you are doing those in FRC level. But we wanted something to help the prescription for coaches and athletes. And we have this power duration curve, and we actually understand, yes, the iLevels are descriptive, but we could optimize it more because we understand within this model what we call parameters, is the mathematical term, but it's specific points of exertion on the model. And those points might be wherever. My lines don't mean anything specific at the moment, I'm just pointing. But we do know those points of exertion. Those points of exertion relate to the way you make energy. And this is an oversimplification, but basically you're making energy in three ways, right? You have ATP, CP, you have anaerobic, anaerobic glycolysis or glycosis, or oxidative, if you want to use the better names. And the reality is, though, you basically are ATP, anaerobic energy, aerobic energy. So let's just say I was to jump up from my desk and go sprinting down my driveway. And I've got a pretty long driveway. It would take me 4 or 5 minutes to get down to the end. The reality is, if I'm running as hard as I can, right, the immediate supply is ATP. But that doesn't last long. That's my rocket fuel. That's my flight or flight energy. But it drops off quickly. Next, my anaerobic system is supplying the power, and that lasts a little longer, probably all the way out here to, I don't know, 40 seconds, 60 seconds, and then that starts kind of declining off and really drops off at some given point. And then my aerobic system, the oxidative system, more sustainable energy over time takes over, and it really begins to be the dominant system somewhere, over time. Now, points of exertion in the model are, high points in the energy and transition in the energy. High points in the energy, transition of energy. So if you think about the PD curve, we actually have the ability to look at those points of energy. And if we understand where they are within the curve, because we understand the power required and the time relationship, then we can pick out those points of exertion for optimized prescription of training intervals. And the reality is, that is what optimized intervals are. This is Joe Ryder from Above's optimized intervals. And what you're seeing here is we don't bother below threshold. Remember, they're all close anyway. There really is no reason to optimize below threshold. But from FTP up to Pmax, we are giving you optimized interval recommendations. We're giving insight into the energy system, even though we bend the terminology a little bit, again, trying to keep it simple. There's a duration target, a high power, a low power. Everything, I should have put a line in here, everything to the left of this is model driven. So let's use max aerobic, or what you might say VO2 max style intervals, right? So VO2 max intervals for this athlete are 2 minutes and 44 seconds long. That's the optimal time. Now, would I prescribe a 2 minute and 44 second interval? No. Maybe 2:45, maybe even 3 if I wanted them to go a little further. So it's good guidance. Be careful of over precision here. And the power range is 320 to 300. Simple as that. That's how simple they are to read. The right-hand side, our kind of consulting group of coaches, in this particular one, Dean Golich and myself kind of drove this, and we're just making some recommendations for reps, estimated time, and recovery ratios. And here's my advice for that. Look at the reps. If you're a self-coached athlete or a coach assign what you think the athlete can do 5. And if that was too easy, do 6. And if 6 was pretty freaking hard, well, do 6 again. And then the next time, do 7. And then the time after that, do 8. Or start with 2 and go to 3. Progression is the key, right? Don't overthink trying to hit some mythical target. Hit what you can do, right, correctly, and then begin to progress the workload. It really is, that is the right process. Optimized intervals, again, are based off the same power duration curve. So what you have here is, let's look at that max aerobic for Jane and Joe down here. So Joe's max aerobic, as we just discussed, his time range is 244 with a power target of 320 to 300. But now look at Jane, who had more anaerobic capability. Remember, her curve was higher and steeper. She should be doing her intervals, her max aerobic development intervals at 5 minutes and 2 seconds. Again, I wouldn't prescribe a 5 minute 2 second interval. I might round that to 5 at 316 to 296. So actually a slightly lesser power target, but a longer time. And in a classic oversimplification, but an important one to understand, and you should research what I'm about to say deeper and understand it better. Basically what Jane needs to do, if she wants to develop her maximal aerobic capability, she has a higher anaerobic contribution. So when she sets off and starts doing an energy, or an interval, her anaerobic battery has more charge in it, and she needs to burn that down so that her anaerobic energy system is more fatigued, and her aerobic system, her oxidative system, is forced to handle the workload. Trust me, that's an oversimplification, but also I think oversimplifications are important because that's basically what you're doing from a training response target. I also think this is why you need to be careful when you see this prescription information of go home when your power drops off 5%, because that could be lead you in certain intervals, and most intervals, to be honest, to actually leave the most important intervals on the table and never do them. So each time Jane does her 5-minute intervals at those power, she burns down her anaerobic battery in the first minute or two, depending on how hard she's going, 30 seconds if she's going super hard. And then the rest of the interval is full on aerobic. But remember, that battery doesn't fully restore each interval, hence why we track DFRC. That battery doesn't fully restore after each interval. And as she goes into interval 3, 4, and 5, again, her aerobic system is forced to supply the energy, and you're actually straining that system more. It's not quite that clean, but that's an important tip and piece of knowledge when you look at, why these prescriptions, why optimized intervals, because it's counterintuitive, right? You might be like, well, I'm more of a pursuiter and a sprinter, and it wants me to do longer max aerobic work. Yep. If you want to build your maximum aerobic capability that way, you need to burn off that anaerobic side and stress the aerobic system. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's talk about advanced analytics. Well, advanced analytics are going to be the topic of our future webinars. I will be launching a webinar series, me and some of our team of people. I hope to bring in different personalities into the webinar, teaching, the specific content. When I say advanced analytics, it's all of this. What am I looking at? How do I build threshold? How do I build Pmax? How do I, build an annual plan? We do plan on putting together a series that will cover a whole range of topics, all based on WKO5 analytics. So based off that, I had a very low level of questions. So either I'm a genius explainer, which if you want to give me credit, I'll take it, or everybody's asleep because it's late at night and we're tired. But I'm going to wrap it up here, and I'm going to open the door to open Q&A. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have. I'll be glad to answer them, ranging, from the individualization, what you saw in some of these metrics, or any other questions you might have. And if not, we can wrap it up and pretty much call it a completed webinar. Hey, Henry, you're welcome. A word on training impact score. Yeah, and I'm going to cover that. The next webinar I want to do is I'm going to do training impact score and the FRC. Training impact score really is a measurement, right? I'm never really good at keeping secrets, so I'm always in trouble for it anyway. So if you think about the power duration contribution curves, the one that has your power duration curve and then shows you aerobic and anaerobic, it's really a measurement. It's the basis, even though it's way more complex than I'm about to say. The basis is time near those curves, and it really is giving us insight into what system you are impacting. So the thing that I think it's important, and I wish I had the visual, if you've read the article, be careful of over-precision. In a scale of 1 to 10, the challenge that we've had with it, we actually have a really good way of creating a raw score. And I almost want to go back to using or giving you guys the raw score. The hard part is getting it on a nice, neat little scale of 1 to 10. So if you look at that little chart that I designed to show you what the scoring is, there's no real difference between a 1 and a 3. There's no real difference between a 7 and a 10. And there's minor difference, don't get me wrong. Meaning, yeah, 10 is a little better than a 7. But you really want to be in the bottom 1 through 3, no adaptation. Middle 4 through 6, or 3 through 6, I forget exactly how I scored it, right? That's minor maintenance kind of load. And it's only that top 7, or 8, 9, 10. Sorry, there's my mathematical flaw. It's that top 8, 9, 10 that have higher impact. We're going to do some work. I think we are going to release how to raw score it. The problem with the raw score, right? Your score is going to be unique to you. So your high anaerobic impact might be a raw score of 1600, where my high anaerobic impact might be 800. How do you get them on a nice, clean scale, right? That's the struggle. And if we came out with the raw score, it almost is like an elite metric. You really have to understand what you're looking at to understand it. We want something more generalized. So we think by being able to blend both over time, giving you the kind of generalized 1 through 10 and giving you the specific score, will give people the ability to do their own analytics. Yeah, it's a good general indicator. That's exactly right. Your point is dead on. Just use the scale. Don't overthink it. Basically, you want to know, hey, this was a pretty good aerobic impact. When we get to the point where we'll start talking about that raw score, I think we can do more with it to impact training stress score, to do a more specific training stress score, but we're not there yet. This is just the beginning. And you've been around WKO4 for a long time, and you know it evolved. To be able to understand all these metrics, you have to introduce them and start using it, right? You got to start measuring and scoring all this stuff, and then you get smarter and smarter about what you can do with it. And that is the journey, which is WKO, right? It's being part of all that. Cool. I think I've nailed all the questions. No worries. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. If I missed your question, just put it in Facebook. We'll get this posted for others out there. So a final question that just came in. What's the best way to use power duration curve to predict a race power number? Remember, just in terminology, the power duration curve doesn't predict performance. It estimates it. But it's an excellent way to look at pacing. But when you say race power number, right, that's such a diverse question because racing is diverse. Do you mean a time trial? Yeah, in a time trial, look at the time. This is going to take me about 40 minutes, right? Use your power duration curve, go about 40 minutes out, look at that power number, and that's an excellent starting for average pace. But actually, there's ways to use it to be smarter. Break the course down. There's 3 climbs. I just spent a lot of time in England up in Harrogate at the upcoming Worlds course, working with some athletes in preparation for the World Championships, right? That course is highly interesting. It's got a long flat section, 3 distinctive hill, and it ends, it starts, the first half's long and flat, slight rise in elevation, then 3 distinctive hills, each with its own uniqueness. And they all come like bang, bang, bang in the same 20 minutes, same 18 minutes probably, maybe even shorter. And the reality is, I break that set down into sections. I actually did a post on this. I started as smart segments in the Facebook group. And then I'm analyzing those individual segments, and I'm looking at the power duration curve. I'm understanding how my athlete's going to make energy in those phases and what's going to cost them and how they're going to put it all together. So there's no one universal answer. Ask me how to use it in a road race. What's your strength? There's where phenotype might give you the initial insight. Then you start looking at the power and say, looking at my physiology, looking at my power duration curve, how am I going to win this race and what could cause me to lose this race? So it's kind of a diverse answer like that. Sorry, don't have a specific one. Okay, excellent, everybody. Thank you for coming. Any other questions, post them in the Facebook group. Be glad to answer, and I'll get this webinar posted tomorrow. Thanks. Good night now.